Today is Wednesday, February 19th, 2025. We're in the boardroom of the Julia Boyer Reinstein Public Library in Cheektowaga, New York. I am the interviewer, Amy Moritz, and I'm with Dr. Gail Maloney, who coached women's basketball at Buffalo State from 1978 through 2000. In 31 total years at Buffalo State, she also served as Assistant Athletics Director, Senior Associate Athletics Director, and Senior Women's Administrator. Gail earned her Ph.D. in Social Foundations of Education, History of Education from the University at Buffalo in 1995 with a dissertation titled The Impact of Title IX on Women's Intercollegiate Athletics. Gail, thanks so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I'm very excited for our conversation. So let's just start. Tell me where you grew up.
Okay. I grew up in Valley Stream, Long Island, which is in Nassau County. And it was the just over the city line of New York City. We were 5 houses away from New York City, the borough. And I went to Valley Stream Central High School and went to SUNY Cortland, which is when I discovered life north of the Throgs Neck Bridge, and wound up making my way to Buffalo.
Fantastic. And I'm going to ask you about coming to Buffalo, but first, tell me about a time when you first remembered falling in love with sports.
Well, it's a little odd probably to recognize the fact that when you're in 5th grade, you know what you want to do with your life. We had a wonderful physical education teacher named Philip Hessimer in my elementary school. And every spring we would have these play days and sports activities. It was a one-day full of outdoor events. And I can remember saying to him, Mr. Hessimer, how do you get to do what you do every day? Because I thought, well, this is the coolest thing in the world. You just play. You play sports all day long. And he said, well, you have to go to college. You have to get a degree in physical education. And, then you get to do what I do every day. And I thought to myself, that's it. That's what I want to do. And so from 5th grade on and participating in those activities really inspired me to this field of sports and athletics. When I was in 6th grade at that elementary school was the first year that they had the program which was called the President's Physical Fitness Challenge. It was a program that was actually started by Eisenhower in 1956 or 7. And not much happened with it, but he was concerned that after World War II, American children were getting soft. So he created this program, the President's Council on Fitness. And in 1962 was the first year that, through the influence of John F. Kennedy, it became a program within the schools. And our school was one that was involved in it. And we had programs of a day-long activities of push-ups and sit-ups and pull-ups and all kinds of physical, a running thing and all kinds of stuff. And I'm proud to say that I won in my elementary school. I got the highest scores. And that really kind of solidified it by 6th grade then. Oh, this is for sure what I wanted to do. When I got to junior high school, all 3 of my physical education teachers at the junior high school were graduates of SUNY Cortland, or at the time called Cortland State Teachers. And I said, well, okay, that's where I'm going to college. So, by 9th grade, I knew where I wanted to go to college. Not only what I wanted to major in, but I wanted to go to college. And when I was in senior high school, I had a phys ed teacher went to Springfield, and the other one went to Ithaca. Well, they were also very good physical education schools, but my family wasn't of the means to be able to go to private schools. So the state schools were really the option for me. So when it came time, I applied to Brockport, and I was accepted, and I applied to Cortland, and I was accepted conditionally. There was a time period where you were accepted based on your academics, but they would not allow you to become a physical education major unless they knew that you had some physical capabilities. It was a screening process, basically. So in February of my senior year of high school, my dad had to take me up to Cortland on a weekend in February, and I had to perform physical activities, throwing the ball, dance. I mean, you name it, they ran us through a battery of tests. And based on that, I was accepted to Cortland. That was my number one choice. Brockport was my standby backup school, so to speak. But, that really is how I fell in love with sports and wanting to be involved. In high school, I played, everything. I mean, everything that we had, field hockey, softball, tennis, basketball, volleyball. Of course, that was when basketball was 6-player, and it was a very different game from what women's basketball looks like today.
I was going to say, you mentioned a lot of sports. Were there a lot of opportunities to play?
Well, I played those sports, but you have to understand the structure was very different because we didn't have the interscholastic kind of play that we see today. Most of those activities were on an intramural basis. So all of the girls in the school that wanted to participate would be after school. They'd be divided up into different teams, and we'd play against each other. So it was intramural is what it was called. And it wasn't until, I think, my senior year in high school, we had some inter-school competitions. See, they created things that were called play days. And girls from all the different schools would get together at one school. And we would have sports activities. But we would be mixed together with different girls, a girl from my school and the next town over. We were all on one team, but it wasn't school against school. So they were play days, and we had the activities, and we had oranges and apples and whatever, and it was a very lovely, safe environment. And women physical education teachers at the time, they weren't into the competitiveness of sport. They were looking at sport as a positive energy kind of a thing, healthy for women, and they weren't into the competitive piece at all. But as things evolved, sports days play days kind of morphed into sports days, and we were still getting together with those other schools, but now we were competing, but still in a kind of social way against other schools. And that then led to the natural progression, which was next more interscholastic, where you had teams that really were picked from intramurals. The best players from intramurals would then represent the school in whatever, basketball or whatever, play against other schools. So that was kind of the genesis of intercollegiate, interscholastic sports in high schools. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until my basketball teammate in high school, when we played 6-player basketball, we went off to college. I went to Cortland, and she went to University of Connecticut. And Francine was voted in our high school senior class as the best female student athlete in the school. I was second best, but that was okay. She was a good friend of mine. And Francine played basketball at University of Connecticut. She was the first women's team at Connecticut to play 5-player basketball as we know it today. Mm-hmm. She's considered and she was the starting point guard. And so she played 4 years of basketball at UConn, the very first team that played in what we now know as women's college basketball. So they do some things, and I'm still in touch with her as a good friend of mine, and they have done some things with that first team, with alumni events and honoring them. And when they won so many of their national championships, they brought all those players back. But, that was the first year in 72 that, in 68, that we had 5-player basketball in colleges. And it also went into high schools at the same time.
Right. That's when you think about the time frame and how basketball, like in your lifetime, has evolved, right? From that 6-on-6 to what you're seeing today, which is way different than when I was in school and even from 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah, it's and I think that's part of why I wanted to do my dissertation on Title IX and why I was so interested in it, because I lived Title IX. Mm-hmm. I mean, it wasn't when I went to college, you became a teacher or a nurse, maybe a social worker, and that was it. That's what women did, mostly in education, actually. But when Title IX came about, obviously things changed, and within every sport, things changed. So I kind of lived that through my whole career.
You certainly did. So you graduate from Cortland.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me how you ended up then at Buffalo State.
Well, at Cortland, I had a wonderful experience. I had wonderful professors. I started out as a very marginal student, improved over the years, and did graduate on time. A couple of summer schools helped in that situation, but I was having a lot of fun. And when it was time for me to student teach, there was a very strict woman, Dr. Patricia Allen, who was in charge of the placement of us girls to go out and student teach. And I'll never forget the day. Oh, it was Dr. Arnsdorf. I'm sorry, Dr. Arnsdorf. She took me in her office, and she said, now, next semester, we have to send you out to student teach. And we are going to send you as far away from Cortland as we can so that you break away from your social life here, and you will be 100% dedicated to student teaching. And we are very worried about you because we don't want you to tarnish the name of Cortland. Well, I took that as a mega challenge. I was sent from Cortland to Williamsville, Amherst, and I that was 3 hours. That was a drive, and so I did dedicate myself to student teaching. And I'm proud to say, for the quarter of the semester that I was student teaching, I was awarded the student teacher of the group. Well, of the 8 of us that were sent to Western New York. So that was my experience, and I student taught at Amherst Senior High School for 4 weeks, and at Windermere Elementary School for 4 weeks. And I ascertained from that experience that I did not want to work with little kids. And the bridge between little kids and the seniors in high school was junior high school, so I wasn't so interested in that. So I was really geared more towards the older students. That was my teaching preference. So I did my student teaching there. I went back to Cortland for my senior year, and a job opening came up at Amherst Central. So the woman had been my master teacher, recommended me to the principal, and I got the interview and got the job. So that's how I wound up in Western New York. I did interviews in the Boston area. I did an interview out on Long Island. I had a couple of different opportunities. One was a junior high school position, and I was But I was somewhat familiar with the high school, and I thought, I think I could go back there and teach. And that's how I wound up in Buffalo, thinking I would be here probably 2 or 3 years and then maybe move on. And well, here I am, 50-something years later. I'm still here.
So how long were you at Amherst?
I was there for 6 years, from 1972 to 1978. And then they had budget cuts. The late 70s, a lot of things, we had the energy crisis. We had, the Carter administration dealing with lots of inflation, and all kinds of stuff was going on. And my position was cut at Amherst. So the principal called me in, and he said, I hate to do this, but they're eliminating your position. And we have an opening next year in the biology department. And we have reviewed your transcript, and you're a few credit hours short of being certifiable in high school biology. Because as an undergraduate in phys ed, you took physiology, movement science, this, that, geology, a lot of sciences. And he said, so if you can get certified this summer, we'll bring you on in the fall as a biology teacher, and you lose your job. I said, okay, great. So I did that. I went to UB, and at the time, UB's credit hours were 4 hours for a course. So I needed 12 credit hours. I had a review done by the person that does that for the state ed department, and she said, if you take this, this, and this, and that, you can get certified in biology. So I took a course in oceanography. I don't know, I don't remember what the courses were, but I did that. And when I was studying for the final for the last course in August of that summer, I had already met with the director of the biology department at Amherst. Was all ready to do that, even though, by the way, I must admit freshman year at Cortland, I got a D in biology. But I was going to teach 10th grade biology. And I was all set, and I got a call from the director of athletics at Buffalo State College. And he said, our women's basketball field hockey coach has just resigned. She's taking a job in Georgia, and we need somebody. Would you be interested in applying? I was like, yes. Certainly sound better than teaching 10th grade biology. So it was a Friday in August. I went to Buffalo State, and I was interviewed by Howard McAdam. And we had a good interview, although I must say he did ask me if I cried. I said, excuse me? He said, well, the woman you'd be replacing was in my office a lot crying, and I would prefer you not cry. I said, nah, I'm not a crier. I was like, whoops. But I said, yeah, I'd love to take the job. And he said, well, why don't you think about it over the weekend? I said, oh, sure, if you want me to, I will. But I'll tell you the same thing on Monday. And, of course, Monday came, and I got the job. And then I had to go back to Amherst and say, find somebody else for biology. I'm out of here. So that's basically the way it worked, how I got to Buff State. But what I didn't know at the time was that a good friend of mine was a secretary in the athletics department. And when this opening came up, she mentioned my name to the director. And he said, well, let me ask around. Now, he was a member at Transit Valley Golf Club. And there was a woman there named Carolyn Mackett. And Carolyn Mackett was very involved in sports in Western New York. She taught at Erie Community College. She did summer softball coaching, and I had gotten to know her quite well. And he went up to her and he said, Carolyn, do you know this girl, Gail Maloney? And she goes, oh, yeah. And he said, well, I'm thinking of... Carolyn said, absolutely. Great choice. Organized, efficient, pleasant, blah, blah, blah. You'll love her. And it was because of Carolyn Mackett that I got this job, really, at Buff State.
And you were there for
31
years. 31 years.
Yeah, 31 years.
When you talked about it a little bit when you were talking about basketball as an evolution when you were playing, but when you started, at Buffalo State, and when you started coaching basketball, can you just describe what was that? What was it like?
Well, when I was hired, again, I was replacing this woman, Dr. Carolyn Lair. And she had been at Buff State for 13 or 14 years and really built the women's program from the days of women's recreation and the whole thing, intramurals, whatever, to the point of it being an intercollegiate program. And she coached field hockey and basketball. And so that's what I was expected to do. Now, my strength actually coming out of high school was field hockey. I had some great teams at Amherst Central. We won several Section 6 championships, which is as far as you could go in those days. There was no regionals or state finals or the stuff they have now, so it was just within Western New York. But we won a couple of sectional championships and had some great success. So that was really like my strength going into this. I mean, I coached JV basketball in high school, so I didn't really have a strength in the background of basketball. But I had a strength in coaching, and I think so much of coaching is how you interact with players and what demands you make of them and whatever. And the X's and O's comes, and I'd have never thought of myself as a very good X's and O's coach. But in any case, so I go to Buff State, and I have this job. So I show up at 8:30 in the morning, which was kind of late because in high school you're usually there by 7:30. And there's nobody in the building, till about 11 o'clock. So I'm diddling around. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing in this job, But it was challenging. I can tell you one of the first things I had to do was go outside and figure out where the field was, and then run to the hardware store and buy spray paint because nobody knew how to put lines down. Because Carolyn used to do that, and she was gone, so now I had to do that. So it was that's the way things started. For my basketball program, we were given the opportunity to use the college learning lab, the campus school gym, which was across the parking lot at the time from Houston Gym. That was, of course, before the sports arena was there. It's a big, giant parking lot between those two buildings. And so when basketball started, that's where I was. So I would have my practices there. All my games were there. We had no visible scoreboard. There was no 30-second clock because the women had the 30-second clock, but the men didn't for many, many years. And so they didn't even, I had this little red clock that you would turn on and off. It was like used for volleyball, and it was used for, but that's how we timed the games. I had a stopwatch there for the 30-second person. Now, I had to do this all myself. There was no events management crew. There was nobody there to help me. We had no stats. We had no PA system. No, it was just, I pulled out a table. I put 2 chairs there. I would have to pull out the little bleachers, and they were only 3 tiers high. And I would set up the chairs for the teams, and I would bring the water. And we had no athletic trainers. I mean, I tried to tape an ankle once. I mean, we had absolutely no services. And this was women's basketball at Buff State.
And you got a D in biology, so wrapping the ankle might not have been...
Well, exactly, yeah, exactly. And anatomy and physiology was just as bad. But we won't talk about that. And so here I am over in the campus school gym with these kids playing these games. And it's like I was like in a dungeon because you went in the school in the back door, down the stairs, blah, blah, blah. I drove all the vans to the games. We didn't have buses or anything at that time. Yes, I washed uniforms, just like Pat Summitt. I mean, we all did that back in the 70s. And this was 78. You think maybe things had improved a bit. But I didn't have uniforms for my team. I had to share the uniform with the volleyball team. So I had to wait for volleyball season to end and then have my team issued those uniforms to have jersey numbers because I couldn't even have a roster with numbers on it until volleyball season ended. So, I mean, one of my first requests was like, do you think maybe we could have our own uniforms? Would that be okay? Oh, you don't have your own uniform? Like, the athletic director and the guys in the department had no idea that this was happening because Carolyn just went about her business. When she wanted something, she went in the AD's office and cried and got something, but she didn't, she just kind of accepted it as it was. And I was like, I don't think this is how it's supposed to be. This doesn't seem quite right. And I had gone through stuff in the high school level. Worked for a great director of athletics at Amherst Central, the famous Bob Hetler. And he was wonderful to work for and very, very good to us in that department. Whatever we needed, he did very well in trying to get us the stuff in the 70s, uniforms and this and that and things. And so I kind of had a sense of what this program should look like at the college. So that was my task. But it was no easy task. I mean, it was lots of negotiating, shall we call it. I learned very early in my career that you need to pick your battles. You just can't go in and demand everything at once. So that kind of is how it all started at Buff State for me.
How did you... So you learned how to pick your battles, and I think that a lot of people in situations, learn what I'm going to fight for, what to ask for. How did you go about deciding, like, do you remember, or can you remember, like, this is what was most important? Like, how, was it uniforms first? Was it?
Well, obviously the budget situation. Do I get money for an assistant coach too? It was those kinds of things, and I tried to point out things just in a good common sense fairness sort of a way, not because we deserved it, but because it was just the right thing to do. So I was able to get, as time went on, to get things I needed. As an example, and I know we'll talk about this later with the AIAW, but during the early 80s, we had a competitive schedule, and I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and I realized that for us to gain a level of respect on campus, we had to be more involved in what the men were doing. And I was active with some other women in New York State at other SUNY campuses to develop the SUNYAC for women, because they had no competition for women at SUNYAC. And I was on a committee with the woman from Fredonia, Liz Darling, and Jessie Gottfried from Binghamton, and Pat Taylor from Albany. And we would meet with the men ADs, representatives from the men's programs, and we would kind of hash out how this thing was going to look and how it was going to work. So I was there on the ground level of SUNYAC for women. But in doing so, I saw that was an opportunity for our players to have a better schedule. We were playing some private schools that were doing some financial aid that we didn't have, and it just wasn't a great competitive experience for our kids. So SUNYAC play kind of leveled that out for our players. And I helped write the Constitution for SUNYAC to include women. And so, like I said, I was right there on the ground level. And what happened was, as soon as we got into SUNYAC, people started paying attention. The press, oh, SUNYAC, we know what SUNYAC is. And also, in my own personal growth as a coach, after I think 2 years, I looked around and I said, why am I the only person in this department coaching 2 teams and everybody else just coaches 1 team? So I brought that to the AD, and he said, yeah, you're right. That's probably too much for you. Which would you like to coach? Now, I'm not stupid, okay? So I knew enough about Buff State and its history in men's basketball, and this was just after the Randy Smith era and all the great things he did for the Braves in the 70s. So I thought, well, I think I'm going to pick basketball, even though I'm better at field hockey, because nobody cared what was going on out on the field hockey field. They really did. They really didn't. But basketball, now. And I thought to myself, well, it's Western New York weather. I could be standing out there in October, November, freezing, coaching field hockey that nobody cares about. Or I could be inside in the winter coaching a sport that there was relative interest in. So I made my decision to go with basketball. But in developing the SUNYAC, there was kind of a method to my madness, because once we were in SUNYAC, okay, so now I'm still practicing in campus school, and now we're having double headers because I was involved in setting up the schedules. So this is where you got the women playing and then the men playing at Fredonia, and then Fredonia coming here and playing. So I said to the AD, don't you think it probably would be helpful for my team if I had at least to practice the day before the game in Houston Gym? Because we're in the campus school all the time. It's a very different kind of court. And I just think it would really help them. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. So we kind of juggled schedules, much to Coach Beer's chagrin, to allow me to have some time in Houston Gym. Well, one thing led to another, and I was happy with that. And then as things progressed, I was like, well, really, don't you think we really should have an even opportunity here with this? So when Fred Hartrick became the director of athletics in 1986, he was just a wonderful colleague, and I have utmost respect for him, and very fair-minded, very intelligent man. And I sat down with him and I said, okay, Fred, now. And I gave him the analogy because he had come off from coaching soccer very successfully for 23 years. And I said, how do you think this plays out? Blah, 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 da, da, da. He goes, you're right. You really should be in the same amount of time in Houston Gym as the men's team. Well, that was great from Fred Hartrick. Coach Beard didn't seem to embrace it too much. So we went to a period of time, probably 2 years maybe, that he didn't speak to me. But anyway, I did get my time in Houston Gym. So much so that we actually had developed a practice schedule that one day a week he had to practice in the campus school, which was, here I had gone from being totally in the campus school, working my way into Houston Gym, to finally having at least one day a week that the men had to schlep across the parking lot to go to the campus school for gym. And when he realized what a terrible facility he was, He was like, I'm not doing that anymore. I said, well, okay, let's work out a schedule that's going to work for the both of us. And we had to flex some times and do whatever, but we managed to work it out for many, many years. So much so that he trusted me to make the practice schedule for the entire season. He would come to me in early October. He said, hey, you got that practice schedule done yet? So I'm working on it, Dick. And I would map out day to day. I said, okay, now what, you got to be home early on Monday because your wife sings in a choir. And you're okay. I'll do late Mondays and what. So I was very flexible with him and worked around his family life and whatever. But yeah, it got to the point where he was counting on me to put the schedule together for him. So, things have a way of working out. But when I say I pick my battles, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. And fortunately, I was able to have some very good teams in those early to mid-'80s. So that kind of opened up people's eyes. I mean, I can remember doing an interview after my first SUNYAC championship on a telephone interview with John Murphy when he was on the radio. That's where he started. And I always think back upon those interviews, So
that's I think that's great. I think it's also a great segue to talking a little bit about what was going on also nationally. At that time, the transition, right? So before 1982, it was the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, which the AIAW. I remember seeing those banners in like gyms, right? The AIAW champ and people. I remember seeing those, but not being around for those. And then the NCAA, took over governance and championships for women's sports in 1982. So I want to know about like your experience in that time frame, because I think when we read it on paper, it's just, it went from AIAW to NCAA, but it was not. It was not unilaterally a welcome decision, and there were a lot of different things that kind of came with that. So,
well, the AIAW was providing championship opportunities for women throughout. It started in the 60s. And it changed names a couple of times as an organization. But when I got into college athletics, it was the AIAW. And they had already gone through some challenges with the NCAA. In 1967, I believe, a group of women went to the NCAA in Kansas City and asked if they would start championships for women. And they were told outright, no, we are a men's organization, a competitive men's organization, and that's where we will stay, and we will not do anything for the women. So the women organized and did it themselves. And you got to understand, Title IX had something to do with this as well. And I don't know if we want to get into that now, but it's kind of a natural progression to the story. Title IX was passed in 1972. And it was passed as legislation for opportunities for women in educational institutions. There's very few words to Title IX. It addressed issues like admissions, financial aid, access to majors, quotas in certain programs. Because prior to Title IX, women weren't going to medical school. They weren't lawyers. They weren't being accepted into those programs. And people thought that was wrong. So they proposed this legislation, and it was passed. After it was passed, there was a woman in sport in Kansas who called the woman in Illinois, who called the woman in Kentucky, who called the woman in Boston, who called the woman in California, and they said, do you suppose this Title IX legislation would also carry through to sports? When Title IX was passed, nobody had any idea that it would have any ramifications for the sport or athletics. It was purely, before Title IX, financial aid was only given to men in colleges, not women. Did you know that? Yeah. Superior living arrangements. There were all kinds of benefits that men received in college that women didn't get, and nobody thought anything about it. No, you can't become this kind of major. You do this. So Title IX opened up educational opportunities for women. So these women in athletics were like, well, what about us? What would athletics be covered under it as well? Well, when when that realization hit, people were like, oh dear, what did we just pass? Oh my. So there were a lot of consternation on the part of men in athletics during the 70s, because now they were realizing that, oh, if this applies to women, where are we going to get the money? How are we going to, what are we going to have to give up? What are we, you know? So that led to a firestorm of activity in the 70s. And in the writing of the implementation of Title IX in colleges and universities, they had until secondary schools had until 1975, and colleges had until 1978 to actually implement Title IX. So they had time to get to where they needed to be. But that implementation was not without any numbers of fights and arguments and whatever. So as that's happening, these women now are organizing with their competitive schedules. And there was a real split in the women in the country during that time. And I started in 1978 in college, and I knew Title IX had passed. I knew what we were doing at Amherst Central to try to make things equal for our teams, but I didn't really have a feel for the college. Matter of fact, my first week at Buff State, I got a call from a woman who was the director of women's athletics at Stony Brook, Sandy Whedon. And she had just heard that Carolyn Lair had left the state. And she called me. Now, there was an organization in New York State. It was called the New York State AIAW, NYS AIAW, okay? And they also had championships more locally, regionally. And she called me out of the clear blue. And she said, well, who are you? I said, well, I told her my name and what I was doing. I'm replacing Carolyn there. Well, are you replacing her as the president-elect of the NYS AIAW? I said, excuse me? I said, I don't know. Ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, she ran up one side of me and down the other for, she was so angry that Carolyn left because she had been the president, which means she had to be the president again another year because Carolyn wasn't here to take over. I was like, well, listen, I said, I'm not really in a position to take over. I said, I got my hands full here with coaching 2 sports and working through things I have to do here. And I said, I'm sorry that this has happened to you, but she's in Georgia if you want to call her. I don't know what to tell you. So that was my indoctrination to women's governance in athletics, being chewed out by Sandy Whedon. Anyway, what was happening is colleges were being told by the government they had to take some money from here, money from there. They were dropping men's sports to help the women's. There was all kinds of things going on at the time, and a lot of angst and anxiety. And what happened was athletic directors went to their presidents and said, you know, if I'm going to be responsible for giving all this money to these women's teams, why aren't I running them? Okay. So in 1967, as I told you, the NCAA wanted nothing to do with women. But by the late 70s, when they realized that women weren't going away and that they were going to have to share resources with them, suddenly they said, well, if you can't beat them, join them. You know, let's take them over, basically, is what the NCAA did. So they proposed legislation in the NCAA for championships for women. They were offering all kinds of goodies, travel expenses paid, this paid, that paid. And the AIAW didn't have those kind of resources. So in the late 70s, when I went to my first AIAW meeting, it was a real split amongst the women, and probably like 600 to 800 women in this conference room. And it was in California. I remember I flew out there with Ellen Conley from Canisius. And we were sitting by different regions. So I was in the Northeast region and then the Southwest region and the West region and whatever. And it was interesting because there was such a difference in philosophy from the women who were out in the South and the Southwest and West versus the Northeast. And it was because their programs were facing very different challenges. Here we were as an organization trying to develop opportunities for our teams. And the challenges that we faced were so very different. And by that I mean, in more of the rural areas, the expenses for travel were astronomical. If you're at the University of Arizona and you're in the Pac-10, you're traveling to Berkeley, you're traveling to Sacramento, you're traveling wherever you're going, all over the West. If you're in Boston College, you're driving over to Boston University, you're going down the road to this one, over to Harvard, you're going over here to, you had almost your entire schedule within 2 hours of your home campus. So, and same with schools in Pennsylvania and in some cases, like as far as Michigan, you had competition in Ohio, for sure, Pennsylvania. You had competition well within a geographic region that it wasn't breaking the bank. So there was a real difference when it came to the realization that the NCAA was going to help you support this competition versus we don't really need the NCAA support. So that kind of was a real rift in the AIAW. So by 1981, schools had to make the decision. Were they going with AIAW or were they going with the NCAA? So my first regional championship was in 1982, I think. I went to the AIAW regional in Rhode Island. But then after that, we joined the SUNYAC. So, I'm losing my train of thought here.
That's okay. We were, want to take another sip of water. We were talking about, that there was that tension in the AIAW, or among women in the AIAW as to, or women who are leading college athletics. And a lot of it was geographic, at that, at that time. And there was that real, need from some of those other schools that they needed the money to help make it work, that the NCAA was offering, which, I think is really, really interesting that's, that reality of, what they may have wanted philosophically versus what they needed in order to make that work.
Yeah, and I think some people took it very personally. I can remember at that first convention, the woman who was the president of the AIAW was Dr. Carolyn Mushir. Now, I had known her as an undergraduate because she was a professor at Cortland. And she left Cortland after being the department chair and took a job out, I forget, one of the state schools in California. And anyway, worked her way up, and she was the head of the AIAW. So I was like, here I was, like, oh my God, that's Dr. Mushir there. And I was like, wow. I said, oh, wow. But the problem then became those of us, and I was one of them, that felt the NCAA was the right way to go at that point. We were like traitors. Some of the older women in New York State didn't care for that, and the fact I was pushing SUNYAC. But I said that I saw the writing on the wall. I said this is going to happen. And by there was a lawsuit filed by the AIAW against the NCAA. It was an antitrust lawsuit because they were trying to take over and dominate and control, and it failed in the courts. So that really led to the demise of the AIAW, and they folded after 1982.
What then was your experience? There's no decision like this is all rainbows and sunshine, right? So when you then had the NCAA sort of take over the championships and the governance of women's intercollegiate athletics, what was your experience then like? At Buffalo State, like how did that change a lot of things in your experience, or was the day-to-day pretty much similar?
Well, it changed in the fact that because we developed the SUNYAC, we were able to, at Buffalo State, create a lot more opportunities for our women. And that was, it was easier for the men to understand that if we had a men's cross-country team why couldn't we have a women's cross country team? We're talking about another 7 or 8 uniforms. They can all get on the same bus. So it was those kinds of things almost were natural, but it was because we were in SUNYAC that they could understand it. It wasn't this gobbledygook of letters, NYS, AIAW, blah, 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 letters that they were not familiar with, and they didn't think that was valid, I guess. We got we got credibility by being in the NCAA and being in SUNYAC, and I think that's what I was hoping to have happen. But when I started at Buffalo State, we had swimming for women. We had swimming and diving, volleyball, field hockey, basketball, and softball was a club sport, which I worked to elevate to varsity status. After being out of coaching field hockey for about 2 years, we had added football in the early 80s, 81, I think. And mind you, we only had one outdoor field at Buff State, Collier Field. That was it. And it was a natural grass, a natural mud field. And that was the playing field. So we had men's soccer playing on it, we had men's football playing on it, and we had women's field hockey playing on it. So I can't begin to tell you the condition of the field. So so it was after a weekend of a home football game on Saturday where it was rainy. I think Friday there had been a men's soccer game on the field, and I think women field hockey had a Tuesday game. Anyway, I went out there and I watched that game, and I said, somebody is going to die. Because if you know anything about a field hockey ball, it is like rock solid. It is a very, very hard piece of equipment. And there were so many ruts and so many, it was just the ball kept popping up in the air and taking strange angles of flight that you would just never anticipate. Nobody could dribble with their field hockey sticks, because the ball was all over the place. It was just an absolute disaster. So I went into Mr. McAdam and I said, somebody's going to get killed out there. Somebody is going to really get killed out there. We got to do something. So even though I was hired to coach field hockey, I initiated the dropping of field hockey and bringing on women's soccer. Because I thought, well, a soccer ball is a lot bigger, and if the men's soccer ball can roll around out there and be kicked, so can the women. So I started women's soccer. Then we added the track and field along with the cross-country component, and I started that. And then eventually I started ice hockey when we built the arena. So I was instrumental in starting lots of opportunities for the women athletes at Buffalo State. I know some that think that because I was the basketball coach, that maybe I had a priority in women's basketball when it came to facilities, budget, blah, blah, blah. But it was actually quite the opposite, because I was very sensitive to that fact. So I often think that if I had not been in the role of an administrator as well as a coach, that my team probably would have fared a lot better, because I would have fought more aggressively for my team. But I had a responsibility to the entire department and all the women's student athletes. So there were times that I would say, no, volleyball, they need new uniforms, or this one needs, we can wait another year in basketball. Softball team really needs an away jersey, or whatever the case was. And I did a lot of that in the budgeting process. But I wanted, a great opportunity for all of our women's student athletes. So that was kind of what happened. But it was all because of SUNYAC. It was all because of the governance structure. I couldn't have done any of that if I didn't have that governance structure to work under.
Right.
Because that was, again, something that they understood. It made sense to them. We had SUNYAC championships. They got excited about them. And that was just recognizing that was going to be the direction it was going to go.
And that makes a lot of sense. That the SUNYAC, right? Like, so the men could wrap their head around it. They could understand the competitive nature of it, and especially since it wasn't maybe all that long ago for coaches and administrators in their experience, where girls were doing play days, right? And
And at Buff State, the Carolyn Lair ran what the WRA was called, the Women's Recreation Association. And from the Women's Recreation Association, they had their play days and their intramurals and the occasional honors team that would be put together that would go play against another school. But it was, it was sort of the women were off doing their thing, and it wasn't athletics. It was just the women doing their thing, But once things started to change from the governance structure, and certainly monetarily, people were like, oh, wow. But what was interesting about that transition with the loss of the AIAW and the NCAA takeover was that now presidents of colleges said, okay, you're in charge. Now you're in charge of the women's program too, speaking to the male athletics director. Okay, so now what happens in a lot of institutions, there was a person called the women's athletics director. Like Betty Dimmick at UB is an example. She was called the women's athletics director. At the time, Ed Muto was the men's athletics director. They had two athletics directors. Okay, who was in charge? For many years, many schools worked with that, but then things changed and governance changed and a president changed, and it became, in almost all cases, that the woman was relegated to a lesser position. She was the associate director, or she was the assistant director, or different titles came about, many of which I held, not the director of athletics. So while the governance structure changed, Title IX was not a very positive experience for women's athletics administrators who had worked so hard to get some equality for their female student athletes. And the athletes flourished. I mean, it was great. The athletes, they had all kinds of opportunities and travel and this and that they had never seen before. But it was the women administrators who lost in Title IX. Most all of them lost their power and their position. Still ran programs, but weren't looked at as the number one. And then another thing happened with Title IX and women's sports that I want to throw in here. Prior to Title IX, 90% of the coaches that were involved in women's sports were women. Okay. After Title IX and after the NCAA, by the 1980s, there were like 47% of the coaches of women's teams were women. We had an infusion of men coaching women's teams. Now, it can be argued, is that good? Is that bad? I mean, that's somebody else's dissertation, not mine. But there were two researchers from Brooklyn College, Acosta and Carpenter, and they did a longitudinal study. Every 2 years, they would collect the data from all the colleges and universities in the country and see the breakdown of their coaching staffs. And they did this for like 25 years. Researchers, like earth-shattering, it's great. But they found that was the trend that was happening. So the question is, well, why? Well, okay, there's any number of reasons. One, it could be male athletic directors were more comfortable hiring men that perhaps they knew. Maybe the assistant from the men's team became the head coach of the women's team. Familiarity with working with men coaches versus women coaches. Some of the things that also happened were salaries started becoming more competitive. They're still not where they should be even today's world. We know that. But they became more competitive. So suddenly those jobs became more attractive. Most of the women coaches coached for nothing or for $500. I think Pat Summitt's first coaching job was $1,500. Pat Head at the time. And so there wasn't any money in coaching. Women didn't go into coaching for the money. But once Title IX came about and the NCAA took over and then we had this growth in the women's programs, we had this whole other resource now of possible coaches. So there were many more men that came into the field of women's sport. Now, some can view that as a negative, some can view it as a positive, some can say, did it ever really matter? But what happened was, with the growth of women's sports changed dramatically in terms of the responsibilities. when you were a high school coach of a volleyball team in the 60s, you had practice 2-3 days a week, maybe. You would have one, this week you'd go to here, and then maybe next week you would go there, and that was that. Once Title IX came around, women who had been coaching went from 8 basketball games a season to 24. Okay? So the time commitment certainly changed. There was an expectation you would practice 5, perhaps 6 days a week. So the jobs, because of the women's role in other facets of their lives, parents, children, families, households, whatever, coaching became a lot less attractive to women. So there were men readily available to be hired. So in some cases, it was just because there were no women to hire. And you'll hear that from a lot of ADs. I couldn't find a woman to take the job. I tried. So, and I think there's some legitimacy in that, because some of the women said, well, this isn't exactly what I signed up for, oh, I got to drive a van now, and I got to take these kids. So the nature of the experience of women's sports changed with Title IX and with the NCAA takeover. And the other thing that happened was, prior to all that, myself as an example, I was athletic. I enjoyed sports. I wanted a career in it. What did I do? I became a physical education teacher. And then I became a coach. And so I was around sport. I was fulfilling my mission that Dr. Philip Hessimer inspired in me in 5th grade. But what happened with Title IX that people don't understand is women had other educational opportunities that I didn't have. I wouldn't have thought about going to law school. I mean, it was not in my radar. Men were doctors. Men were lawyers, And so when Title IX offered those opportunities for women, they took advantage of it. So now you had student athletes that were not just phys ed types. They were everything. And you would have a team of girls that one was going to be a teacher, but this one was going to law school, and this one was going to medical school, and this one was going here, and this one was going there, and she became an accountant, and she became this, and she became... And they weren't oriented into the field of physical education and sport. So you had all these athletic women didn't go into sport. They went into something else because Title IX gave them that opportunity. So in Title IX, helping women achieve athletic success in their colleges, it really reduced the opportunity or the availability of women to coach women, because they went and did something else. They didn't want to coach. They became a lawyer. So it was interesting what the impact of Title IX and how it changed the experience of women. And to the early pioneers that put their blood, sweat, and tears and washed the uniforms and did whatever, it was nice to see somebody like Pat Summitt make that transition from where she started that program in 1974 in Tennessee and what it became. That was a great thing to see her have that happen for her. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting when people say, well, who cares the gender of the coach? What does it really matter? And you'll ask a lot of female student athletes, and they'll tell you that, because nowadays they almost all have men's coaches. It's rare in high schools to see a woman coach in any sport. And most athletes will tell you it doesn't matter. I want a good coach. I want somebody who's going to coach me, somebody who's going to care about me, somebody who's going to teach me the sport and help me be my best version of myself on the field or on the court. And they don't care. So there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure people have done dissertations on it, on does it matter or doesn't it matter. And then there's those that will argue, and they'll say, well, when the women were coaching women, the students saw women in positions of authority. You're a decision maker. You're deciding who gets to play. You're deciding how you want to do this. You want to do that. When you're going to take a timeout. When you're going to do. You're making the decision. And they felt, in terms of role modeling, that was important for young women to see a woman making those kinds of decisions, that women are capable of doing those kinds of things, because maybe that translates into other aspects of their lives. that women are competent, women are capable. So, there's a lot that goes on to it socially and culturally when you talk about this whole evolution of women in sport and where we came from and where we went, where we started and where we are right now. And, I mean, the jury's still out on this whole notion of what's happening in the women's sports area. Does it really matter?
Yeah. It's that was wonderful, and I feel like you've already described like your dissertation. Like that was, which was
That's why I wrote it.
Right, exactly. But I mean, so I guess was your idea and your impetus to look at it because of the lived experience and what you were noticing, or did you discover that as you were, or was it a little bit of both?
Well, I tell you, when I started it, first of all, I didn't need to get a doctoral dissertation, a doctorate in my job. I just wanted to do it. I felt I was working in higher education, and there were many people on campus in different fields that had Ph.D.s. And for my own sense of legitimacy, I felt I'm working in a college, I should have a Ph.D. Not that I needed one to coach Division III women's basketball. So it was a personal decision on my part. And so I took all my coursework in the 80s, and then I had to work on a dissertation. And I started in the area of higher education, but then the department at UB, the graduate school, kind of reorganized, and they took away the concentration of higher education, and they made it social foundations of education, of which higher education was a part. Sociology was a part. History was a part. Philosophy was a part. All of education. And so I was like, and that happened while I was a student there, and I said, well, gee, I got to do, maybe there was a professor there, Dr. Maxine Seller, and she was a wonderful historian on women's education. She knew everything about how women came into this country, and many immigrants, and how education evolved for women, and what happened in many different fields, whether it be social work or sociology or nursing or education, public health, whatever women were involved with. She was wonderful and knew everything. And the one thing she didn't know about was sports. So I had a conversation with her one day, and I said, I said, I'm thinking of doing my dissertation in history of women, but in sport. And she kind of looked at me. She said, I don't know anything about that. But she said, I'd love to learn. So let's work on this together, and I'll be your advisor. Because you got to kind of suck up to a professor to get them to be your advisor in graduate schools, And she embraced the idea as a learning experience for herself. So it was great, and really helped me get through the process. And that's how I fell into the area of oral history with her.
That's and the women that you interviewed for for your dissertation, were they what you had just described, were those the experiences that they were telling you about, like in a nutshell?
I was able to interview a number of women who in my view and in history will view as giants of first of all, Doris Soliday from Syracuse. She was an icon at that university. She took the time, and I drove out to Syracuse, and she gave me the interview. I went to a couple of AIAW meetings. No, I'm sorry. The AIAW had folded, and we had this new organization was called NACWA, National Association of Collegiate Women Athletic Administrators, whatever. And I went to some NACWA meetings, and I had contacted people, and I was able to interview Christine Grant, who was like a giant at Iowa, Charlotte West from Southern Illinois, Kay Yao from NC State, Jean Rowlands from I want to say Boston. Was she at BC or BU? And several others, but formidable people in the field. And from them, I learned a lot about some of the history of what happened prior to my being around, or even their experiences. And so what I did is I focused my dissertation on women who had been at the same institution for the entire careers. When I interviewed them in 1994, they had been there since 1972. So that was the longevity that
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot from them in terms of what happened and how it happened. But it was interesting. Another thing, when we talk about the benefits of Title IX, and I mentioned how it was negative for women administrators. Also negative for a lot of participants. Because prior to Title IX and this giant organizational collegiate program that developed, women had varsity programs and they had JV programs. And they had any number of variety of sport activities for girls. Once the NCAA got involved and women had to put more resources into their programs because now they weren't playing 8 basketball games, they were playing 24 basketball games. They cut a lot of programs for women. And they cut what you might call minor sports at the time. I mean, they had this major and minor sport thing, which I know is out of fashion now, but they were the least number of participants involved, and they cut some of those programs. They cut all the JV programs for women. So they had less participation, actually. That's one of the results of Title IX. Less women playing rather than more. Now, they did add some sports, so... Excuse me.
Go ahead. That was like one of the things when I read about the AIAW kind of model versus like the NCAA model, I feel like one of the things lost in when they went to the NCAA. I'm all for like very competitive women's athletics, but then I feel like you lost those women or those young girls who just wanted to play for playing sake, and they maybe didn't have that. They couldn't go to the playground and pick up ball game like the guys could. They didn't, and so those opportunities went away in favor of putting more emphasis on the competitive.
Exactly, and that's just what women physical educators did not want to see happen. But Title IX brought about the demise pretty much of women's intramurals. Mm-hmm. It's almost non-existent now. Some colleges still have men's intramurals, and some of them have co-ed, but it's rare to see an actual women's only intramural program in today's world.
Want to stay in the history track, but shift a little bit. And in the what was it, like the late 90s, there was a huge push. So we're talking. I want to talk about nicknames. Oh, so like at Buff State, it was the Bengals and the Lady Bengals. And there was, a time when there was a big push for gender neutral nicknames, right? It was like everyone's the Bengals, the Lady Bengals. That makes me feel othered, and I'm not as good as I'm something else. But I know that you were the lady, but like you defended Lady
Yes,
Bengals.
I did.
So you're, and I know that we've had this conversation in the past, but what from your vantage point, that importance of that Lady Bengals moniker?
Well, you have to understand the history of this. Now, when women became as active as they did in sports, they were fighting for their sports teams and their identity. And during a time period in the 90s, you had other groups of women from the women's movement fighting for women's opportunities. Okay. And there was a real disconnect between women in athletics and what they viewed as the radical feminist movement. Athletics and sport by its nature kind of has come through from a very conservative point of view. Even though the women were fighting for women's equality, it was in sport. Okay, they never wanted to be associated on their campuses with the radical fringe of women who were fighting for women's causes. They never wanted to be labeled feminists. There was a term that was unthinkable today in feminazi women or whatever they call them that was real derogatory towards women. And women in sport didn't want any business of it. They wanted to stay away from it. So what happened was, it was really, I think, personally, more from the feminist point of view of this moniker of what we would be calling teams. Mm-hmm. Lady, that's so derogatory. You're a woman. You're not a lady, first of all. And I just didn't buy into it. I mean, not that I don't think women's rights are important, but the world of athletics was a different place. You may or may not have been conservative yourself, but you were certainly dealing with a faction of our society who, by almost all standards, could be considered extremely conservative, and that's men in sports. And we see that today, too. We see that a lot. Just look at the field goal kicker from Kansas City, and you know what I'm talking about. But we tried to keep a distance from that feminism, the whole thing. So when it came to our name, they were the Bengals. And when we started our sports teams with SUNYAC, we had to be called something. So we were the Lady Bengals. And it just seemed natural at the time. And I fought that when it started in the 90s. And I still resent the fact that the almost the day after I stopped coaching the Lady Bengals basketball team, they just became the Bengals basketball team. And I always felt, and still to this day, that there should be something that distinguishes one team from another, because I still pick up a sports page and I still don't know what team they're talking about until we get halfway through the article. And even with certain names that are kind of gender neutral, you still may not know what they're talking about. So I wanted to hang on to that Lady Bengals, and I was successful while I was coaching. But once I was not in charge of the program anymore, things changed. Some schools struggled with it, but I always felt, hey, listen, if it's good enough for the Tennessee Vols to be the Lady Vols, and it's good enough for Louisiana Tech to be the Lady Texters, and it's good enough for, it's good enough for Buffalo State. So I kind of hung on to that. But there was a real disconnect for many years on campuses. Of the 24 women I interviewed, I think 4 of them, I want to say, maybe 5, had a positive relationship with the women's groups on their campus. Most of them wanted nothing to do with it. They didn't want to be perceived as like super radical, super, aggressive, takeover kind of women. And for the most part, they weren't.
That's, interesting. But do you think that there's any, because they were, like you said, whatever you may have been personally, you may have been very, very liberal, or
right.
Maybe aligned with some of the policy changes other people wanted, but it wouldn't be good for them professionally, right? Because they had to operate within that system.
You realize, when I was hired at Buff State, there was one other woman in the department and me, and then she left, and then we hired our athletics trainer, softball coach, so there were 2 women. And I interviewed one woman, Susan Chapman from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI. And when she was hired in 1974, I think, to start women's programs. Now, WPI is a technical institute. And if they had 2,000 students on campus, they had like 200 women. Okay? It was very small. So she started small. She, for like about the first 8 years in her job, she was the only woman in her department. She was the only woman. So you can imagine being in an environment where you're trying to build programs, you're trying to start this for that, and you want to get this, and it was you were pretty isolated. So you kind of had to, as they say, read the room. Yeah. Know what you're dealing with. And again, this gets back to the pick your battles thing. You don't go into an environment where you look around the room and you go, and start ranting and raving about all your demands. It's just it wasn't going to work, And you certainly didn't want to be associated with those radical feminists marching around the student union demanding whatever they were made. Well, this was but this was an interesting thing because that was at a time period where the Equal Rights Amendment was trying to be ratified state by state. Interesting, we're still fighting over it to this day, but the AIAW would not hold their national convention in a state that did not vote in favor of the ERA. So there were some states that they never went to.
Oh.
Did you know that?
I
No,
did
a
not
lot of
know
people
that.
did not. AIA conventions were only held in states that had ratified the ERA. Yeah. So
That's interesting.
even though they were women in sport, they still had their, they still had their hand in what would be right for women, So that's kind of interesting.
It is. It kind of maybe a little bit flows, but I'm wondering, like, over your career, I'm sure you got support in a lot of different areas, but maybe even like when you were, where were some places or some people that you found the most support?
Are you talking internally in the college or outside the college?
I guess like both. Like if when both.
Okay. Well, when I started at Upstate, Ellen Conley was in a similar role at Canisius, and Nancy Riccio was in a similar role at Niagara, and Betty Dimmock was at UB. So we got together at lunch one day and decided we formed the Little Four before the men did. Because the men were off in their various conferences and stuff. And so we used to compete with each other in a couple of different sports. And that lasted until the scholarship situation got so that they were getting a lot better players, and I was getting, UB was still Division III, so the two of us were kind of getting shellacked in every sport because they were both started off at what they called Division II. So they had some scholarships, but they didn't have the stuff that Division I has. So that kind of was the beginnings. And so we would help each other out, and there was a lot of support there. As far as internally, I have to put all my eggs in the basket of Fred Hartrick. I mean, he was just a real champion for what I wanted to do. I think he respected me. Understood what I was trying to accomplish, and I always got good vibes from him in my career there. And
I hate when people say your favorite memory, because it depends. For me, people can ask me that, but it depends on the day. But do you have one or two favorite memories of coaching or being an administrator? Because as you had mentioned, you did bring a lot of new programs in as well.
Well, I think every program that I brought in, I felt, some ownership of it. And I would sit and I would say, I wonder if these kids have any idea who I am or what I did, that kind of thing. And then you say to yourself, well, they're enjoying themselves, and that's really all that matters. But I'm proud of what I accomplished at Buffalo State in terms of the opportunities that the players had and still have. And as far as my favorite memory, wow, that's a tough one. I mean, I just think it probably involves the coaching of basketball. I had one particular conference championship. Actually, it was my last conference championship in 1994. We had a pretty good season, and early in the season, we played our nemesis Geneseo, and we beat them by, I think, like six or 7 points at home. So we had to play them on the road in February, late February. So we went down to Geneseo, and oh my gosh, they cleaned our clocks. It was like we had never picked up a basketball. If we could do one thing wrong, we did 12 things wrong. And they had an All-American, Katie Smith, on their team, and she scored 32 that night against us. And we lost by 32. So it was not a good experience. Now, a week and a half later, we're going to compete in the SUNYAC championship because we were, I think, second place in the West or something. So we go to the SUNYAC championship, which was being held in Potsdam. So we go up there in late February, and we play, I forget what team was first round. The second round, we played Binghamton, and we beat them by a point. So now we've advanced to the championship game. And who are we going to play but Geneseo? Now, a week and a half earlier, we had just gotten demolished by them. So how are we going to beat this team? So we did a little strategizing at breakfast that morning with my assistant coaches, and we decided to change up our defense, and we played what we call a box and one, which is basically like a zone around the basket, but there's one defender that you have that chases their best player, which was Katie Smith, around the floor. So I had my guard, she was a sophomore at the time, Amy Danner. And she, I said, Amy, you're going to be on Katie tonight, and I don't want to score in a point. She looked at me. I said, she is not to score tonight. If not for her, we would have won in Geneseo. This girl cannot score a point tonight, and it's your job to make sure that happens. Okay, coach. So we get out in the first half, and the Geneseo coach was flummoxed by the defense that we were playing and the fact that Katie really was having trouble getting open for shots, getting open for even passes. So she did, and she took one shot, and she missed. So anyway, so halftime, kids come off the floor, and we were up by 5 or 6, I guess, at this point. Kids come off the floor, and Amy looks at me and says, Coach, how am I doing? I looked at her real sternly, and I said, Amy, she put up a shot. I told you I don't want her scoring tonight. She put up a shot. It could have gone in. She just looked at me like, oops. That was the last shot that Katie took that night. She was 0 for 1 for the entire game. She was an NCAA Division III All-American. 0 for 1 in the SUNYAC championship game. And we won by 5 or 6. So that was a game that, I think back on, and I think about how I had to handle that and how I had to handle that player. And, of course, afterwards I, gave her the kudos to, but it was a monumentous game for us and something that they never expected to have happen. They just thought it was going to be a cakewalk, So it was probably my most enjoyable victory because, often in coaching when you have a strategy, a plan, and then something goes awry or somebody gets hurt or whatever, and it doesn't quite work out that way for you. But in that particular case, boy, it worked.
Definitely it worked.
It worked.
For sure.
So that was probably a very memorable time. But gosh, there have been so many different things that have happened. And you see the players go on to be teachers and some of them coaches and the things they've accomplished in their lives. And to know that, you in some small way you may have had a hand in what they did, that is very rewarding to me. They often told us when we were undergraduates in education, when you go into teaching, don't ever assume that you're going to understand that you're making a difference in a student's life. But something will happen somewhere along the way, and you'll find out that you did. And often we see that like in awards shows and stuff. We see some actor thanking their, high school drama teacher or their English teacher or whatever. And I think in coaching, you think, well, hopefully they'll make a difference. And I've been fortunate enough to be around long enough that I have seen and experienced those kinds of things with some of my former players. And I tell you, the interesting thing is social media has helped me a lot in that regard. I wasn't involved in it when I was coaching or even when I was working at the college. But when I retired 15 years ago, I got on Facebook. And I now have a very nice little group of former players who are on Facebook. And I know that's not the most popular one anymore for the younger kids, but for my era of students, it's just fine. And so it's great because I get to see people and what their lives are doing and how many kids they have and where are they working. And it really has connected me in a way that I never knew was possible. Of course, I tell coaches today, you guys have it so easy with social media. When I was coaching, and as I told you earlier, we had a lot of challenges with the scheduling and facilities. And when football was added, that in the late fall, we'd have some bad weather or something, and football would say, okay, we have to come inside today for practice. So Dick and I would be scrambling around to tell our players, no, practice isn't going to be at 4 o'clock, it's going to be at 7:30, you know. Well, I had their schedule on a piece of paper, all of their schedules on paper, and I would have to look and say, okay, it's 1 o'clock and so-and-so's and this goes. I would spend an hour and a half running around campus from building to building, finding my players and telling them, practice has changed, it's at whatever. And I say to the coaches today, you send out a text. Boom, they're here. I said, you have no idea what it was like when I was coaching. I did things now, and I think to myself, my goodness. And then, of course, there'd be the one kid who wasn't in the class they were supposed to be. And I'd be standing outside the classroom by the door with my arms folded, standing there, watching the students walk out of the classroom, and then look, and, no Susie. Well, where the heck is she? And she would hear about it later because she wasn't in class when she was supposed to be. So those are the kinds of things that when I think about the changes and just the evolution of how we function as a society now has changed. But the Facebook thing has been fun for me to be able to stay connected to players and throw little thoughts out to them every once in a while and remind them of a funny thing that may have happened or whatever.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Gail, thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome.
This has been a great conversation. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Just checking my notes here. Oh, this was another thing. I just want to I want to add about the AIAW, which I thought was really interesting. And I told you how they only had their conventions in states that ratified the ERA. They did another thing that was very interesting, and it was really in order to protect themselves. When we took votes on legislation in the AIAW, whether it be rules about transfers, the AIAW rules were a lot more lenient than the NCAA. We allowed more latitude for what the student athletes were permitted to do because we felt it was part of that history of having a great experience with sport. And so the NCAA was a lot stricter because they were much more results money-based. So, you couldn't transfer. They had rules where freshmen weren't allowed to play. If you had to sit out this time and this time for transfers. I know that's all changed now, but there were a lot of pretty strict rules, and most of them were not to the benefit of the student athlete. Right. They were to the benefit of the institution. And the AIAW rules were very different. But what they did is when we would take a vote, okay, it was a hand vote, okay? It was not, they never did an institutional roll call. So when I went to the AIAW, I was voting as Gail Maloney in what I thought was best regarding this particular legislation. I wasn't voting as Buffalo State. So they eliminated the roll call. They never had a roll call vote of colleges. So you would go to an AIAW meeting, and let's say we permitted transfers to play immediately when transferring. And then the vote might have been 650 to 50 in favor. So you go back to your campus, and you say, well, the women are allowed to do this. Who voted for that? Well, this was the vote. Well, I don't know. Well, I didn't vote for it, but a lot of people did. So it was a great cover because you didn't have to have that level of accountability. We still had that opportunity to run women's sports the way we wanted to without being tied to that being accountable to the men back home. So it was kind of an interesting philosophy in terms of protecting themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always make sure 10 people vote in the opposite direction.
So
someone you can be
right.
like, oh, I voted against that.
Yeah. So that was kind of an interesting take. Let's see. I think you pretty much covered most of everything that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, I think we got it all there, Amy.
All right.
And do you have any other?
I mean,
thoughts?
I could talk with you for a couple hours.
We probably could go on further, but when you asked me my initial question about my dissertation and why I was involved in doing this research and stuff, when I said to you, my career paralleled Title IX. I mean, I was there.
Yeah.
I was there for all of it, from the very beginning to my college experience. I mean, when you see Title IX was passed in 1972, I graduated college in 1972. Implemented Title IX implemented in secondary schools in 1975. I was in a secondary school in 1975. Had to be implemented in colleges and universities by 1978. I was at a college in 1978. So everything that I did in my career was on the forefront of this whole movement with Title IX. So that's really why I wanted to. I mean, I knew my experience, and I knew the experience of some of the women in the area here, but I wanted to know what other women, had to say about it. And what I found probably most interesting is it was some of the negativity I hadn't anticipated hearing from people about Title IX, how it changed the direction of coaching because women didn't go into sport anymore, and how it changed the role of women athletic administrators. Those are the things I had never really even thought about until I did this dissertation.
Yeah, and still not recovered from that.
No.
In coaching or administration.
No, I don't know that it ever will. I don't know. And again, I keep saying that's another dissertation. Does it matter? We talk about the role of women and authority figures making decisions as coaches, but does that really matter in today's world? I don't know. I mean, you'd have to survey young people, but the thing is, there's so many women. I mean, I can tell you from my experience in just recruiting locally and around New York State, of course, but for many of my players, that was the first time they had a woman coach, was me. Most all of them came out of high school programs where they were coached by men.
Wow.
And this was in the 80s and the 90s. So that in and of itself, I think sometimes maybe they questioned my credibility. I certain players, and I knew the coaches they played for in high school, and I got the sense that maybe they didn't, think I was as legitimate as their high school coach. So I found that kind of an interesting dynamic that, I had lots of success and we had great experiences with our players, but I could sense from a couple of players on occasion that they were like, But that's where we are at with women in sports now.
Yeah. Great. Well, Gail, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. All right. That's